person who painted the Grand Canyon and showed it back at people in Europe. They were involved just as much in like creation as real depiction, I think, and in what they're choosing to include and all this stuff. So I've thought about kind of like landscape painting as a way of really creating worlds, I think. And so the actual things that are being projected are kind of often details from old master paintings. And so, like for example, most of the time I try to avoid like really famous references. So it's kind of like you think that you would maybe have a feeling of recognizing something, but not just go through my work and list off like, oh, this is these famous paintings. But this one behind me right here and over there, it's a detail taken from Hieronymus Bosch's The Garden of Earthly Delights. And that's probably one of the more recognizable forms of kind of like this very kind of abstract imagery of like curling forms going into the sky that a lot of people would probably recognize. But I mean, really what I'm looking for in a backdrop is, I would say it's a space ultimately to present this form. And we were talking earlier about kind of landscape format of paintings versus portrait format of paintings. Of landscapes, and really began thinking of them almost as like portraits of these objects actually. And not only that, but almost like potentially an event or like a moment in time. Like if you think of like a timeline as being horizontal, that like this vertical becomes something that's more like singular in this moment on that timeline. So I think a lot about, just like I was talking about, kind of like a history of forms and architecture. Same thing in landscape painting, that ultimately it's all about like the symbols that in many cases lots of artists have been using before me to describe our experience, and whether that's rainbows signifying redemption, or like the certain way that light falls through trees, that in my view, landscape painting is much about us as it really is about the planet. It's about the decisions kind of the artist and how they're choosing to represent it, how they're choosing to create it.
Thank you. Well, that could lead us in a lot of different directions. But one thing that really strikes me about your paintings and the relationship to the landscape further is this idea of perspective. And I think if you look really at all of these works, you often have a sense of perspective being kind of broken, right? Or that is kind of the rationality of space kind of being misused very intentionally. So you're drawing from this tradition, 15th through 19th century, which is really associated with things like Brunelleschi's invention of perspective and the kind of implementation of linear and aerial perspective. But as you look at the objects, you can often see very, very kind of easily that they are, of course, placed in front of what is ultimately a facade. So I'm interested in the way that you think about perspective, how it plays a role in your work, and how you're interested in maybe thinking about kind of the history of the use of space in Western art, maybe breaking it.
Yeah, that's been a concern for a long time, and I think I go back and forth from trying to create something that people really can feel and imagine what it would be like being there still, like creating enough of that kind of context for a world that you can still feel like you can enter. But also then there is this remove and maybe this false shadow that lets you know that the backdrop is actually flat. Kind of a reminder that you're looking at a painting maybe too. Like I like that that feeling, like, I mean, literally, like someone else's painting is my backdrop. And so that actually was something that was flat that I'm referring to. And then there are objects like you see in front of you that have actual form. And so I'm kind of reconciling those two things together. And at times blurring the boundary between them and making them feel like more cohesive and more like a world that you can believe in. And at other times highlighting kind of like how one thing stands out so much far apart from the other. And um, I think I've thought a lot about, if the images of landscapes and the structures are two kind of main poles, or like what I would call characters in the work. Like the last one inevitably is paint, and that like not forgetting that you're looking at a painting and seeing that like the strokes are still making something up. Like even though I use a lot of like photographic references in my process, I'm still very engaged in like the touch of the brush on the canvas or the linen, and allowing particularly the backdrop areas to remain painterly and to be even accentuating kind of like the expressive like brush marks that I might have seen in another artist's work, and contrasting that then with like the very like rigid forms of the forms. So I want it all.
Thank you. I do love the painterly effect on the surfaces of your canvases. It's really just, to me, very, very beautiful. Um, and of course, that idea of world building is so important. And we've talked a lot about that. And for me, it's one of your greatest strengths. You know, very consistently across these paintings, I feel like I'm in a familiar, consistent world. Um, so I'd love to hear more about that. But before we talk about that, you were kind of thinking about the kind of backdrop, that kind of notion of it looking a bit like a facade. And I love it when painting can kind of contemplate its own falsity, but also its own kind of beauty. And I think that's what it's doing. And for me, that goes back to traditions like mannerism, or even the back of Mona Lisa. So Leonardo's famous portrait has a facade-like backdrop. It really kind of expresses both its artifice and its beauty so effectively. And I love it when a painting does that. But let's think about world building. Across this exhibition, your world's seen both ancient and futuristic, both familiar and alien. So I'd love to have you contemplate what connects them, and even more so, maybe what kind of narratives or big ideas you hope to have us take away.
Yeah. Right before I answer that question, I wanted to mention the Mona Lisa, because you brought it up. That, I mean, that's such a perfect example of a portrait with a landscape as a backdrop. And I think that like I look at a lot of portraits actually, and sometimes take little snippets from what actually was behind it and use it. You can imagine a structure standing in for the woman in that painting. Very similar kind of process. But I mean, in some ways, I think your question goes to kind of like the objects too, and like the fact that I'm pulling them from like very different times. And I mean, I'm a huge science fiction buff, and I think I've been working on reading like the top 50 science fiction novels of all time for like the past 3 years, according to NPR readers. And so like using things like that as a reference. I think that I'm also I love history and like history of forms. I grew up in Edinburgh, Scotland, and I was back in Britain recently and doing a tour where I was scanning like standing stones, like Stonehenge, and like, so if you notice like the Stonehenge form that's below that painting, for example, right there, that's based on a scan that I took of an actual Stonehenge stone while there. And so kind of like almost acting like a archaeologist in that way, and like unearthing things that connect to, the position of them connect to like the stars and the sun and the light and our planet's rotation. So I think that that's a very old example of like what we've been talking about with the forms all along, and kind of connection to it. But I think too that, like I was mentioning with science fiction, like I love also, I mean, there's this like concept of like the paper architect, which is like buildings that have never been built but have only ever been designed. So maybe even something that never will because they cost too much. But like this concept of something that has never been built, and so there's this one designer I think you have on the later question, so I'm sorry if I'm spoiling it, but Ettore Satsas was an Italian designer of the Memphis group who has these sketches of fantastic structures that were never built. And so in a recent series, I am actually making models of them and placing them in landscape. So it's like realizing these things that have never actually existed on the planet in a really fascinating way to me. But going back to the time element of your question, I think that it's it's kind of like I feel like there's a connection running through all of these things, and in some points that's just very intuitive. Like someone's asked me, how do you know if a form is going to be able to be a part of this vocabulary or not? And there's no complete answer to that. But pulling things from different times, I feel like they've functioned in similar ways for people over time. And and we're at a moment now in history when information and access to all these things is so much more readily available than ever before. So I think that it provides kind of a new opportunity at looking at it all together and kind of understanding where we've been and understanding potentially where we're going.
Oh, I love that. And I do want to talk about the specific objects. So you mentioned Satsas's room divider, and it is located on this work, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's one of the miniature forms. It's a famous room divider. I see it now. And it is kind of an icon of postmodern design. And of course, it's made out of Formica, and it's multicolored. It's very much a reaction to the kind of purity of modernism. But here it looks so kind of pristine and white and small. So you've changed a lot of things.
On the top floor of the High Museum.
Oh, that's right.
Which is where I encountered it.
Oh, really? Yeah, and I really, really love this movement. It's called Memphis, and it is kind of taking its name from ancient Egypt, but also, of course, Memphis, Tennessee. So it's kind of pointing to the kind of multifaceted ways that a signifier can function, right? That name Memphis. Anyway, let's talk about some of those objects. So you've got the Memphis room divider. You have Leonardo's mechanical clock. You have Sarsens of Stonehenge. You have telescopes. You have geometric forms I don't quite have a name for, which I really love. You have ruins. You have, of course, a broken obelisk. Can you kind of reflect on the selection of these objects? You've done that a bit. And will you tell us how you transform the objects in a special way for this exhibition?
Yeah. So just real quick, the object that she's talking about, like from the telescopes on the top of that pyramid, if you come 2 steps down towards me, that's the one. And and the actual thing is brightly colored, multicolored. And I think that I was fascinated by how when it appeared like that, it had kind of like this. It spoke almost to like a standing stone in a different way when it was monochromatic like that, especially when the stone was white as well. Or it reminded me a lot more of older forms. But I mean, I think that another part of your question, maybe, I can't remember if you directly stated it or not, but it was kind of like the materials that they're made from and kind of that process too. And I've had the benefit for over a decade, at least, of teaching what's basically a intro to 3D design class for college, but to high school seniors. And so that's a part of the AP program. And so what you see in terms of the objects here, like I really don't think of myself as a sculptor at all. In fact, these were, I call them working models, and they were always created with the intention of informing paintings. It's only been very recently that they started actually creeping into the shows themselves, at the urging of some people who've been to my studio and kind of seen the behind the scenes like process. And so it's really a grab bag of all kinds of fabrication techniques and kind of like the wonder and just like curiosity of like really simple things, from just like the way that a certain stone looks. Like some of these things are completely unaltered, found. Some of them are found objects. I think that there is, oh no, it's not here. It's in the other show. There's those things that you wrap a pear in the grocery store, like when it's standing, it looks like a building that you would see in Qatar, right? And so like that's on one of the shelves of this other show. So from things that are like completely just found and recognized to be like a visual synchronicity on a micro scale, to things that I've carved myself, like out of soap or out of wax. some of the things are 3D printed, and some of them are found 3D models. Like, for example, I have a chess set that are all rocket ships, which are on that pyramid over there. That are, you can see there's like 6 of them on a step all together. Those are found forms, right? So it's like I found them in a Goodwill store. I might as well have, but they were online and virtual, so I printed them. Um, but then I'm also designing my own forms virtually, and in some cases, actually printing molds that then I'm casting using other materials like the poured wax and soap. And so like that piece, the kind of like the pyramid structure um, on that one, you can actually see the piece coming out of the mold in that one. So I think that like, I'm not sure that I realized how much I don't, that I'm into history, and maybe to a much greater degree than a lot of artists. I always kind of thought of this like process of like unearthing like volumes of information about forms or images or landscape paintings. Like that feels to me just like the work that I do as an artist. But I think that I've come to understand even more that that actually is a part of the content of the work, and is really exciting and liberating to me. That almost any book that I pick up, any form that I discover, can instantly become an object. And you asked too about objects that don't become paintings. Like that happens all the time. And in some ways, like this is my sketchbook, right? So it's like if you have sketches that don't become paintings, it's like mine are just living out there in the world and kind of have their own existence in kind of a funny way. And I think that I mean, that's a really good segue too, to just mention that like to me there has to be a huge amount of intuition as a part of this process, right? And like I did not set down deliberately to create any of these paintings in this room, and that they came from a process where you're literally seeing in front of you hundreds of forms that could have informed them, and so there could be like 95 of those that are not even in the paintings, right? And so I think that it's fascinating to me that like I would have never anticipated like this form that's on the top of this. You see that form repeated there, you see it repeated on that painting, you see it repeated on that painting. That like that became, unbeknownst to me, like a really important form. I just loved how like oddly specific and geometric it was, and when it was tilted, how it felt like something that had been planned and something had gone wrong with that plan. And that's the coastal ruin, right, of the title of the show, kind of like the centerpiece of it. And that was not a form necessarily that when I made it that I thought, oh yeah, this is clearly going to be something I'm going to base a whole series on, right? In fact, I think that it came from an MC Escher drawing, but that this was almost like the back of it. Like there was a much more intricate part that like is not even seen. And that form is the second step down over there. So you kind of, and if you pay attention really closely in the show, there's moments that where you can see things like that, where like something is echoing something else. Like maybe we'll talk about those walls later. I'll let you ask another question.
Well, I want to hear maybe more about the geometry that you use, and that's of course present in the objects as well as the paintings. So you're using circles, triangles, cubes, and for me, this conjures up this idea of perfect geometry, which has been important since early Christianity, of course. But I know in the Renaissance, it was really important to architects and artists and kind of expressing notions of the divine. But I want to hear, why you're using this kind of geometry and what it maybe means in your personal kind of iconography.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, because you have triangles for sure, or pyramids, and you have circles, and then also these cubes that are really present. And I think that like the role of like geometry in the work, I think, is something that I've thought about a lot, and I don't have just one answer to. That in some ways like they are very abstract, right? And so I think that there is something about the work that is like what does it mean when you put something that is abstract in a representational context? And like, does it refer to something that is supernatural or like above us, or not, like something that is perfect that like is kind of unable for us to comprehend.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that like I've thought of it is kind of two ways. Like the things that seem to have more like defined forms in the paintings, sometimes they feel like things that humanity has controlled or like attempted to control.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the backdrop, you have more organic forms like the grass, the trees, the sky. And those things, that could be the man-made versus kind of like the planet or nature is in opposition. But I also think about geometry as like the perfectness of it is potentially being beyond us. And like in particular, like in a piece like this, like with a pyramid like that, um, the title of that painting is Timeless, and definitely inspired from like pyramidal structures like that seen in like science fiction, also kind of like the movie Dune, if any of you are familiar with that. The older one though. Tarkovsky, I think.
David Lynch.
Well, him too.
Oh,
yeah.
oh, the other guy. There's
The guy who never made it.
That's
He was,
yeah,
he was the paper architect of Dune movies. But there's a great documentary about it. But just this idea that, and this pyramid, I mean, it's in the painting out there as well. There's a bunch of other paintings that I have, but when I use it as a symbol, it's often something that is not being affected by time, because you see mountains that are getting worn down, you see waves coming in, but this point is kind of like perfect. And like, so having it, there are other paintings that I have where that form is kind of in contrast to a mountain. You can see that has been like almost like erosion is affecting it. So I like that kind of like struggle to understand like humanity's like relationship to geometry. I don't think there's any easy answer.
Thank you, and I love that duality of geometry standing on one hand for the divine and what's inhuman and immaterial, but also on the other hand suggesting what is very human, and that's what's constructed and artificial, and that kind of duality runs throughout. I'll have about two more questions I want to ask, and then I want to open it up to you all. We've talked a lot about time, and for me there's kind of this nice tension of each individual work seeming a little timeless, as in the title of this one behind me. And of course, it may be an enduring appeal of painting, this idea that painting can take you to this very static moment, and you as a viewer get to kind of, maybe in the best of scenarios, experience this sensation of timelessness. For those of you in our criticism, Michael Fried calls it presence, if you remember that idea. But then there's also this idea of the passage of time, and that's really evident by seeing the totality of the show and seeing how the light shifts in different paintings. So some of them dark, some of them light, but they show the same scene. Will somebody hit number 1 on that keypad out there? Thank you. So we're thinking about time, and of course you have these allusions to timepieces and clocks throughout Leonardo's clock, but also the cyclical arrangement around these paintings suggests the passage of time. And one references sunrise and the other sunset. And also you use, of course, sand finally to obscure the objects in the sunset installation. So I loved it to hear about that idea and the notion of the ruin. That's one of your kind of big motifs. And of course, ruins have this quality of being mutable, right? They're these things that erode and change over time. The obelisk is one of my favorites because it suggests the fact that the obelisk once was a symbol of victory. And of course, it changes. It can be a symbol of victory in more than one culture. Famously, of course, the Romans took Egyptian obelisks to show their victory over the Egyptians, and then the broken obelisk finally suggests the kind of pointlessness of all of that, right? The sense of defeat and obsolescence. And then finally, that ruin could be something new itself, the foundation of something new. And that's another kind of theme that runs throughout. So I guess I want to ask you about this notion of time and or ruins and cycles, which is something we started with, and it'll lead me to my kind of final question.
So when we were designing this show, I mean, I had told you that the series title for years had been The Shape of Things to Come, and I believe that was printed on the materials from way in advance. And as the time got closer, I wanted to make it more topical or kind of like a subset of work in there. And so we landed upon the this idea of the rise and fall of the sun over coastal ruin, and specifically drawing out some of these themes in the work where you're seeing the same form, and it could be almost at different times of day or different times of years. And I mean, that's potentially present in all the work, but specifically in kind of like those two walls over there, it really is a clustering of three paintings that have kind of a lighter side over here and then a darker side over here. And it's kind of like the same three subjects, but handled in different ways. And so I love this idea of really both like the symmetry of this room and coming in and feeling like this corner versus that corner, and then thinking about kind of like the passage of time and the feeling, at least, of the movement of the sun, which of course we know the sun's creeping towards us as we speak. I need to get a great time lapse of the light in this room over time. But I just love the idea of presenting that in such an overt way where kind of installing them on the wall in a way where the telescope is looking up at this other form, and then you have these circular blocks almost kind of imitating like the movement that we perceive the sun to be doing around us, and kind of like this meditative aspect of like on all these different forms. And so if you look from one wall to the other, and kind of there's comparisons of forms in the objects too, like from one geometric piece to another geometric piece, from one ruin to another ruin. And if we interpret kind of like the dark wall as having been around longer potentially, which is kind of what I was thinking, at least, with this idea of adding sand to the forms, which kind of obscures the geometry, right? So it's like some of those forms are perfectly geometric, but we no longer see them as such because of particles that have kind of like affected them with gravity. So I think that across the whole work, you're seeing similar subjects in different, like vastly different locations even, which could be interpreted as like hundreds of years later, right? That form and like this form being the same. But yeah, that's a good place to leave that one.
Yeah. So we've talked about how these conjure this notion of past and future, but I want to bring it to the present. So as we all know, good science fiction and fantasy often convey the concerns of their own time. And the title of the show, The Rise and Fall of the Sun Over a Coastal Ruin, suggests both repetition and inevitability. So I'd love to hear you reflect on that, and also maybe weave in, as you already have done, the kind of overarching title of the series, The Shape of Things to Come, which references a 1933 book by H.G. Wells, in which he imagines this period of social decline kind of coming to an end with a new utopia. So the kind of creation of a brand new society after a long period of kind of the dark ages, if you will. So that's kind of built in at every level, from title to object to painting, this notion of kind of utopia and dystopia. So I'd love to hear about your ideas regarding our contemporary moment. You could think about things like climate change, deep space observation, increasing presence of satellites and technology in the sky. And then finally, if you could weave into that notion of whether you're an optimist or a pessimist, I'd love to hear more about that.
That's all?
So many.
So the present moment, yeah, I mean, there's so many things I could say. I promise I'll keep it relatively brief. I do think, and I'm sure so many artists would say this, but I do think that this work was begun in 2018, and I was still formulating, and when 2020 happened, I really think it crystallized for me a large part of what I was after in it that maybe I hadn't even known before. And that was, I mean, with the pandemic and the world feeling like it was shutting down, and all of a sudden this very real possibility that life as we knew it might not continue the way that we thought it was going to. I feel like I had this overwhelming sense that like what I had perceived to be life was actually a very like small period of time in the history of our planet. And that ultimately there are a lot of things there that I think are inevitable, and life as we know it probably will end at some point. And sure, it could continue in different forms and in different ways, in different places, who knows? But it's going to look very different than it does right now. I feel like that's pretty certain. And so I think that feeling of being in a moment on this huge continuum was really powerful to me ultimately. I mean, and there's both optimism and pessimism present in that. I mean, I choose as an artist to be just kind of in awe of like the wonder of everything that's been and to come, and like the forms that and basically the forms I see as like humanity's way of responding to our present situation, what we hope for. And so I think of that as very optimistic, and there's also something beautiful in the fact that all things will end. Like people love looking at ruins, right? So I think that there is kind of like an acknowledgement that like no matter what that thing that any of you has in your mind right now that you think is going to be that great next thing that you're going to build or make, maybe not even physically, it could be a website, right? But like someday people are going to be looking at that thing as like a relic, right? And like I can't believe people used to use this technology, and that's kind of crazy and humbling, but like also I think really powerful that like we're a part of this huge continuum of things that is constantly shifting, and I think that we can sometimes have the illusion that everything that we know is just going to continue. And that moment changed that for me in a really profound way. That also connected me back to science fiction and the future. And sure, I think like I was describing at the very beginning, like not being the kid growing up who could draw anything from my imagination, right? And so I had to create this like really convoluted way of being able to access subjects. And now it's like I read in the New York Times like about the James Webb Telescope and like these new images of the solar system that are blowing minds, um, and all of a sudden then I can immediately turn to putting telescopes in my art, right? And feel that. And I think a lot about like the mirror paper and the function, like mirror paper is on the bottom of all of these subjects in the paintings, right? That's like what this is doing here, and it looks a lot like water, and the way that it reflects but it ripples, and it's like you can almost imagine that like this painting back here is like a one point in time, and then here like the water has risen, and all of a sudden now all we can see is like the top of that mountain, which also happens to look like a whole planet in a really interesting way, but it's also like just a mountaintop. But there's definitely something about the sun rising and falling, specifically over the coastal ruin, right? Which is the feeling that like the water may have risen, and things may not be as they were designed, and so I think that connects in a very real way to climate change and concerns about the future. And I actually do have a series also that I'm working on with satellites right now, and beginning to use forms that are hovering in a really interesting way. And that's, I mean, you can look at, how many satellites there are around the Earth right now, and it's insane. We almost have a complete coverage cloud over us of surveillance, and that's both amazing because of human ingenuity and also kind of terrifying in a way. And so it's definitely not all pessimism. I think I am an optimist at heart, and I think that I choose to be curious and full of wonder about these subjects, bringing it back just to that idea of also beauty and things ending.
Thank you, Ben. That was a wonderful conclusion. I'd like to open up the floor for questions. If anyone would like to ask a question, raise your hand and I'll bring you the mic.
I'm curious about, you talk a lot about science fiction and physics. There's this idea that in higher dimensions there are objects that our minds can't conceive.
Yes.
Your false shadows are giving me the idea that maybe through shadows we can conceive some of these higher dimensional objects. So I just kind of wanted to pick your brain on how that's playing into your work, and then also this idea, we talk about the arrow of time, maybe being able to slice into that at a specific moment, which also takes me to higher dimensions. And you have the backdrops of the ancient world against these very futuristic objects, and it made me think that maybe you're attempting to slice that arrow of time in a way. Could you just give some thoughts on that general concept and how you approach it?
Yeah.
It's a beautiful question.
Yeah. Oh, I love that question. There's so many things there. I mean, I just finished reading the Three Body Problem trilogy, in which they talk about like unfolding dimensions. And so, I mean, what you were talking about with the shadow there is almost like a manifestation of that. First of all, I would highly recommend. I mean, it's some of the best books I've read in a long time. But that's a case where I've always been interested in stuff like that, and a lot of times, like the telescopes were in the work before I read about the Webb telescope, and that's really cool when that happens. And the same thing with what you're describing. I think I am interested in interrogating reality, and maybe there's an unfolding occurring with the shadow, but like hearing it that actually spelled out as like a narrative in a story like Three Body Problem, which I think articulates almost exactly what you're talking about. I read that very recently, and I've been making this work for years, but I think that I've always been, and I love that you connected it to physics too, because I think that is in it. I'm definitely not an expert in that, but I love this feeling of like probing at what's known or what's possible in a way where you're going into even conjecture, right? And the other part of your question was also good. What was it?
Arrow of time, slicing arrow of time, juxtaposition of the ancient world against the futuristic.
Right. Yes, I think that I was talking earlier about kind of balancing, presenting this thing as a cohesive kind of world that you can just enter and kind of believe in and imagine what it would be like, and yet also it's picking so many different moments of time and bringing them together in a way and doing that, and or at the very least, even sometimes within one painting, but other times across the body of work, and I do think that there's I think I'm interested in both the differences in those times, but also comparing them as similar moments, like almost that we've always, like humanity has always been here and has been struggling with, reconciling what we're here for and what's to come and how and what to bring to that, and I feel like I don't quite know why this makes sense to me, but I feel like making it about all time also feels like very of this moment now. And maybe it's what I was saying earlier about we're in a moment where information is so much more accessible than ever before. And I think that it also seems to me that we're at a moment where things are going to start changing so much faster. And it's kind of like this very like precarious tipping point that is neither good nor bad necessarily, but a point where we realize just how small a period of time we've been living in. Does that answer?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. That was a great question. And for me, I'd say this, when I first saw Ben's work, I was drawn to the fact that it suggests a kind of time that's not exactly linear and a space that isn't really Cartesian. It's something else. And maybe we can't describe what that is yet, but it's like we intuit right now in this moment that we're going to understand things differently. We're on the cusp of this kind of greater understanding, whether that's philosophical, scientific, or otherwise. Right. Any other questions?
Don't be shy. Ask something.
Oh,
All right.
Jay.
It feels like such a simplistic thing to ask after such a complex thought process.
That's okay. Simple is good too.
But on average, of course, with model selection time, model building time, scrapping ideas, all of that, how long do you think you'd say you spend on one piece? Because you said this collection took you about 3 years, so I'd love to see, like, personal pieces, how long you think you took time to do this.
Okay. that's a really hard thing to answer in terms of like from conception and models to painting, because and I will answer your question, don't worry. But like I'm pointing out that like sometimes I'll have a model that isn't used and I don't know how to use it, and maybe like 10 years later I'm like, oh, that's what it was for, right? So there's no in creating a process like this, there's no line that's direct to trace, right? Um, but I can answer the question maybe more directly just about the paintings. That, you know, at least all the work that's here, I pretty much like I work in layers. I work like wet into wet on an individual layer. So there's not a lot of like reworking into it, and so I'm really, like I was talking about before, interested in the touch of the brush and being painterly. And so when I'm painting, I paint pretty fast. And so like in, for example, like this painting back there, so it's like the entire backdrop could have been done in like a sitting or maybe two. But then I'm waiting for that to dry, and it's oil paint, and so that takes a while. And so I always am painting on more than one at a time. So it's like I'll do a layer on one, and then I'll go work on something else. And so then maybe the shadow layer came next, right? And then I'm doing the shadow. So I'm actually building it like physically, like it would have physically existed. And then the object comes in. And then once the object is there, then like the fourth layer is like painting the reflection of the object now that it's there. And so there's at least kind of 4 different stages in painting where I'm also having to wait in between. And then there is a kind of a making sure it all is working and going back over certain parts of it. So it's rare for me to have a painting be done in less than a month, for sure, for that reason. But I'm almost always working on 2, 3 at a time, and the larger ones can take even longer, like it probably at least a couple months. Okay. What else do you want to know?
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, Harley.
No question is too simple.
I don't know if my question's going to make any sense, but I don't know, as you were talking, I just kind of thought of the what's the movie, The Truman Show? I don't know how that makes any sense. Like, going beyond the reality of what that is. I think that's such an interesting way to put it. I just, as you were talking, I just thought of this, like, the reality that we need, but going beyond that. I think that's really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you've seen the show. I mean, not The Truman Show, but like, yeah, that one.
Yeah, it's been a long time, but I definitely saw it. So I know at least what you're talking about. And while I wouldn't say visually that movie inspired me, I like conceptually, it's completely in line with it. And even this idea that the world that as we see it is false is kind of a fascinating one, or at the very least, like just real only from a certain perspective, or that there's something behind it that maybe we're not quite seeing. Right? And I love kind of all those ideas and ways that could play into science fiction as well. Yeah, no, that's good.
I love that association too, because you are thinking about the kind of constructed reality of this world that gets ruptured. And that's a key point in the movie. And this rupturing happens again and again to me with the shadows, so that you're always reminded of the constructed nature of these kind of worlds. For me, the objects are calling to mind, especially these sculptures, the monolith, of course, in 2001, Stanley Kubrick. So I keep thinking about that. Any other questions? Yeah.
Also a little simple. I just want to pick your brain on the process of picking color. Because I know colors have a big impact on the kind of essence of a piece. So I wanted, I know we from Blue Steve have what's mostly school colors. So I just wanted to know the process of how that works.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. Because we haven't talked about that much yet. And I think when we were installing in here, someone asked asked me how many years this work was, and it took me a while to even think that it's been about 3 years of painting probably. But that the color is very consistent across that, and I think that it is a lot of like instinctual, like I'm not often deliberately going for it. Although as I've made more work like this, I think I'm starting to become more and more deliberate where I want to push the series, and where I would describe kind of where I was at this point, which most of these paintings at least are a year or two old at this point. Is it's kind of balancing naturalistic color, right? So like you feel like, oh yeah, that sky could be that color, and the land could be that color, with something that could be even like a slightly more like constrained version of that reality, like you're only seeing like the cool tones in this landscape, to even like, I mean, some of the work over there, the landscape is even like kind of like faded, so the reality of the world feels harder to enter, and balancing that with kind of a hint that we're not just looking at something completely naturalistic, right? And so that, like, I would say, like the pink tone in those paintings, right? Like that starts to indicate that like something potentially artificial is happening, and I mean, that really is a part of the process of like in the studio. I'm choosing paintings that are the colors that I'm using to paint, but then also lighting the objects in a way where then they stand out from those palettes. So it's kind of like an overlapping color palettes kind of a thing in a way. But I've thought a lot too about even in this work. I mean, the triangles was a big departure in terms of color at the time that I did it. And it's still a bit of an outlier, but like allowing for a broader palette in like moments of high key color, or like somebody told me once that like I never painted red, right? And I was like, huh, I didn't really think about that. And then immediately I went back and researched like, well, when were there like volcanoes erupting in like the history of painting, and like how can I use those? And so none of them are here. But if you go to Atlanta right now, in the Swan Coach House Gallery, there's I think at least 2, maybe 3 paintings that have like a high key red moment in them that is coming from something that feels like an event. And I found that there's like certain colors, particularly within like landscape, that feel like you can get away with like a moment of it, and then it's kind of like balanced by like the more pastoral like blues and greens or like darks, and that's kind of like what some of the warmer colors in this painting are doing as well, or even like the pink in something like this, but that the red, the deep red that appears can do that across like a series of work, like on a wall as well. So yeah, I love that question. Not simple at all.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay,
I'm so sorry.
That's good. The audience questions are always the best, you guys.
So, for me in my artwork, I tend to veer more towards a fantasy type vibe because I do very much enjoy like fantasy motifs, and you said you really enjoy science fiction. But I've noticed with especially my artwork, and the more I create my artwork, I begin to see the world in more like a fantastic way. I see more whimsy in the world because I put that into my artwork.
Yeah.
So I kind of wanted to see, to separate you from your art for a little bit, just how do you feel your work has interacted with how you see the world, if that makes sense? How do you think it's changed the way your eye perceives things?
Yeah, it's that's a really good question, a hard one to answer. But I think that and this could be said of any artist, but my work has made me more observant for sure. And like, I mean, even if you just look at the objects that are on this pedestal right here, I would have never looked at all those things and seen a connection, and now I do. And I mean, when I see things in the world like that, right? And that inevitably is like someone could be looking through like an ancient Roman textbook and I'm like, oh my god, that column, like that's something that I need to make, and then immediately I go into like 3D rendering software and like build it and like, print it, and so it's created so many opportunities for me to have that aha moment that I get to enjoy just as a human, right? Like aside from being an artist, like I'm excited by Roman columns now, right? Like, I mean, like some people might have been already, I don't know, but probably not many people, unless you're in Rome for the first time and seeing them, right? And it's like it's accessing that like that love and like joy of like experiencing something that's unique and being in love with it, you know, or understanding something about it and having a connection to it. Like when you go somewhere, like let's say you go to a foreign country and like you see something that was in a book that you just read, right? It's like it's that experience, but everywhere, like all the time.
That sounds like a wonderful place for us to wind up. Thank
Oh,
you all
one
for
more.
being here.
Wait, one more.
One more?
You,
Okay.
you still had a question?
Colton?
For Colton.
Last one.
When I was looking at these, and you kind of hit on this earlier, thinking about like, geometry, and geometry suggests perfection, and looking at them and seeing the geometric shapes, but also the lens kind of suggests perfection and imperfection, or a loss of perfection. And then you talked about like the background of it being a facade. So I was just wondering if you could elaborate on the theme of perfectionism in your work, if they're involved in, the nature of if perfectionism is real.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's another complicated question, but a really good one. I think I can try to answer it in a couple of ways. There's always like a balance between how deliberate I should be when I'm making a form or assembling one, and it really working well for a piece. And so, like for example, like the painting that's like right on that wall right there, which is mirrored over here, it's like literally just forms like stacked up against each other. Like there was no structure that ever looked like that. It was shapes that were assembled in a momentary way. They were much larger than any of these. That's actually one of the oldest pieces in this show, and I used to work with forms that were much larger, almost like that size, like it would have been, or even larger. Forms that were that size or larger. And so kind of like balancing kind of like a ramshackle way of just like assembling something, and that just for whatever reason, like that was the form that worked the best at that point in time. And I have at least 3 paintings based just on that form. And I think too, like in terms of the forms, like I'm fascinated in all kinds of fabrication. Like there's a glass cube on there that's clearly been like machine made. There's 3D prints that are geometric and perfect. There are things that are found objects that also have been made in a factory, right? But then there's things that I cut in not even that carefully that like refer to geometry out of styrofoam, but clearly are imperfect. Actually use sculptures made by my children at times too. Like this is kind of a funny anecdote, but like one summer, like they were down in my studio with me, and I had this futuristic architecture book, and I was like, here, and we'd flip through the book, and I'd point to one, and like they'd get $1 for making a sculpture in 25 minutes to the best of their ability of this futuristic structure. And so some of these things, like I loved how they referred to these ideas that were like beyond us, but like were like crudely constructed. And some of the things that I make out of clay I would categorize as crudely constructed too. I'm not a sculptor, and I think that like I'm also not that precious with them, and sometimes they break, and they're better that way, right? Like at the lowest step on this one, there is something that used to be like a perfectly constructed like cube out of plaster, like bars, and it broke in half, and now I've used only the half of it there, and I love that idea that like something could be made and then broken, and ultimately kind of like finding its true form through that. So yeah, I think that's what I got.
Thank you. It was a wonderful question to close on. And I want to say thank you to a number of people. First, she's not here, but I want to thank Pamela Diaz-Martinez for introducing me to Ben. She exhibited
Thanks,
here
Pam.
in 2022, so thank you, Pam. And she also, of course, had some wonderful ideas and work to share. Thank you to Chris Kelly, who helped in so many ways, but most importantly to me, helped install on Sunday. So that was vital and crucial help. Thank you to all of you who helped this afternoon. Melody, you came in and just jumped in and helped. Pedro, I gave you some tape and some scissors and said go fix it. Thank you, Pedro and Jess always. Colton and Carly, thank you for your help. Jackie, you helped this afternoon as well. And if I'm missing anyone, I'm so sorry. Thank you to the students who participated in the critique, Becca, Jeannie, and Georgia, and Dreama for letting us into your classroom and disrupt meaningfully. But thank you all for being here. Most importantly, I really love a chance to kind of share these ideas and of course share art with you all. So thank you. And Jefferson, Jeff, is he here? Where's he? He's running the show. So thank you, Jeff. All right, thank you everyone.